Hi, it's Tushar here. I'm a musician, songwriter, composer, and producer based in Los Angeles. I've written and produced records for Demi Lovato, Chris Brown, BTS, Zayn, Noah Cyrus, and many others. But today we are doing the masterclass for the Atomic Shift podcast. And I thought instead of looking at a whole song arrangement, sort of going into the nuts and bolts of that, which is probably at least an hour of a masterclass, we'd have a quick look at something I did more recently, which was the theme music for the Atomic Shift podcast. So let's just have a quick listen at the music real quick. Here we go. All right, so you get the basic idea. So for me, in terms of creatively, where does this piece come from? How do I start with it? So for me, the idea was okay. This is music for a podcast. It's likely going to be chopped down into, probably less than the first 10 seconds, which is what you hear at the beginning of each episode. But even still, it's good to kind of flesh out the whole musical idea so that the clients, in this case the writers and the producers of the Atomic Shift podcast, they're able to chop it down into something that suits them. And in terms of from a creative point of view, I had to think about okay, what does the podcast represent? It's about different ideas, different perspectives. It's got to be slightly edgy. It's sort of discussing things that you wouldn't otherwise maybe think about, or you wouldn't otherwise get the perspective of. Interesting guests. And so I went sonically. I decided to go in the vibe of this sort of lo-fi, sort of drum and bass heavy funk thing, which sort of gives it a little bit of that edge, but still keeps the central musical idea very very simple. And so the whole piece of music is centered around this bass idea, which you get in the first 4 bars of the track, which is this. So this is a bit of arrangement 101, really. We have a very simple musical idea, which is a riff, this bass riff here, and I've actually played it on my Fender fretless jazz bass. I don't have it in the studio with me today, but the whole piece is centered around this one idea, and one of the sort of key elements of arrangement or production is you have to set up the musical idea and then work around that. So that means throughout the arrangement, what we're doing is we're building on this central idea, which is the space riff, and we're building stuff on it. We're adding drums, we're adding different parts to it, and we're taking things away. And that happens about, you can see on the map, roughly around every 4 bars, something's changing. So that's not a hard and fast rule, but it is pretty much a go-to rule for arrangement, especially in a popular music format, which that's the arrangement that I've chosen for this piece. So once we get into the 4 bars of that, we're adding the basic element of this drum groove right here, which is over here. So that's the basic that's the vibe. We've got the bass and the drums, and the bottom end is always super, super important in establishing really everything about the feel of these kinds of tracks. So what else do we have here? We've got this, by the way, this drum groove here is just a bunch of drum samples that I've chopped up, you can see, and I've actually processed them in a few different ways. You can see what I've got with this shaker here. If you listen in headphones, you can probably hear it panning left and right. Got a little bit of a pan one there. So all of that stuff is really to create movement. And once again, if we look at this, the way the track develops every 4 bars, you can see different elements being added, and the shaker gets added for movement in this section here. Now, once we get to this section, we can hear the very first of the what's technically called a counter melody. So it's this guitar piece. All right, so the idea behind that is that's actually, I played it on an electric guitar and heavily edited it because I cannot play that fast. And what I wanted to really get with this sort of counter melody is I wanted to add a little bit of an Indian element to it, since we've got that representation in the podcast. And so, you know, it's my take on very, very well commonly used riff, or, you know, cadence in bhangra, which is that has that real swing to that ding ding ding, that whole swing to it. So let's have a listen to just the guitar. Now I've put a bunch of effects on there because just the guitar alone, this is what it sounds like. Wow, it's just so lifeless and dull, and you can hear that. And so, you know, these are more, now we're getting into some of the more technical sides of production. So I've added a distressor here, which just gives it some gives the sound some color and some saturation. I've added some light distortion. It's actually not that light, it's quite heavy. And then I've got this sort of flangey effect. Let's hear it without. So you can see when I put that on, it gives it a whole body and stereo sort of space that just wasn't existent before. Then what I'm doing is I'm sending it to another 2 set of effects. And this one is really, really important for this, because what I really wanted was for the guitar to have a space after the melody. So it plays the melody, but then you have to sort of hear the tail of that. And that's the kind of thing that gives it a, you know, quote unquote vibe. So let's hear it with the space real quick. So you can hear that the sound sort of tails off. So for that, I've got this Modely, which is just an effects panel. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that I've tweaked on this that's giving it that tail that rides out. And that's really important, just because in this section, there's a whole bunch of space after here. But I want people to remember this idea and to have the vibe continue. So yeah, a lot of these smaller decisions that we make from a sound design perspective on individual sounds, they are really there to create movement or space and vibe and feel in the track. And in this section here, which is basically, this is kind of like the chorus. I've added one extra guitar thing here. Yeah, so this is the chorus of the track, and this guitar here, what it's really doing is it's basically doubling the bass riff. So that's one of the other 101s of production, is you have the central melody, the central idea that's happening in the track, and in the chorus you accentuate it by having another instrument play the exact same thing. So this is obviously playing it a little higher. So all of a sudden we have so much more energy in this section right here, you know. Let's play it all together. Now what am I doing on this sound? We've got a little bit of sound design stuff in there. I've got a distortion plug-in over here. You can see I can crunch it a little bit. And then what I'm doing here is EQing. We'll get to that later on, but this is a very, very important part of production. Okay, so actually let me add one other thing to this. Let's see, what's the best way to do this? I want to actually create some stereo width in this sound. Let's go for double. Now you probably just heard just how nice and wide that made the sound. And then in this little breakdown section, so what I really wanted to create here is, we need, even as we move through the arrangement, we need a section where we're building some tension before we bring back the central idea, which is this bass riff over here. And what we're doing here is I've taken the bass riff out, and we've got a whole nother section of thing coming, but you have to constantly let the listener know, okay, we're building into this tension, we're building the tension, and we're going to bring it home and come back to our central idea. So here's one of the simple ways to create tension is you do what we call a pedal, which is just hang on a single note on the tension note of the key. So that's just doing that, and we've got it EQ'd. So that's actually from an analog synthesizer that I've played. But you can see it's really just doing the simple singular note leading into the final sort of section of this, and then I've got these guitars playing a sort of it's almost like a reggae type rhythm, actually, weirdly. So these are two guitars, panned left, panned right. I've got them going into here, and we've got a whole bunch of effects on there. Now, one of the things I want to touch upon is, from a production point of view, what you really want to do is, from a sonic perspective, you have to create a full spectrum of sound across the sound frequency spectrum. So, for example, with this bass, one of the ways we are achieving that is I'm keeping all the bass in the lower frequencies here with this EQ plugin. So everything below 1000 Hertz and above about 25 Hertz, I want the bass to occupy the majority of this room in the whole audio spectrum of the whole track. So what that allows is it helps the listener have really, really clearly identifiable parts exist in different parts of the frequency spectrum. And obviously there is going to be crossover, and you want that crossover because you want it to feel organic, and you need some of that dynamic to happen from a sonic point of view. But you also need to isolate certain frequencies for certain parts of the music, and that helps bring them out, and it helps them make them very clear in the arrangement, and it allows the track to breathe, and it allows the track to feel much cleaner in the mix. So with these drums, let's have a look at so the drums are pretty much playing across the frequency spectrum. You can see there's a dip here, and that's because I want the guitar and the bass to sort of live, and the other instruments really to live in this frequency so that they can show off more. We want the bottom end in the drums because we want the kick to really punch out, and we want some of this expensive top end to show off the cool percussion happening at the top. And for me specifically in this section, I wanted this sort of cowbell thing to really come out. Yeah, I love that bit. All right, so here we go. So let's have a look at the end. So yeah, let's keep looking at that EQ side of things. So with this guitar, for example, we have guitar mostly taking up this space. What I would normally do, I kind of rushed this track, but what I would normally do is EQ some of this bottom end out. We don't want any of that mud to take away from what the bass is doing, especially since it's the central element of the arrangement. And so yeah, after the breakdown, we have everything's going back in. And you can see here we've got a nice little fill, which is basically, this is an old school drum machine fill. And you need fills and different elements to basically transition from one section to another. That allows the listener to sort of know, okay, something's coming up, something's going to happen. we're going to move into the next section, or we're going to move back into a full other section. So that's that field, but there are also these other transitions that I've got here, which is just some pretty standard reverse sweeps and fills to move ourselves from each section. And so that's basically the production for the Atomic Shift podcast theme. Now, obviously, most records are much more complicated, and they involve a lot more production knowledge in terms of how to treat vocals, how to treat different types of instruments. I've gone for a pretty simple instrumentation here, only because this is a theme for a podcast and needed to be simple, and it needs to state the musical idea very, very early on and establish that very early on, and not have too many parts in it, because it just doesn't need that for this particular medium. So that's something to always keep in mind when you're producing. What is it for? Who are the intended audiences? Where are they going to listen to it on? I was very aware that mostly the Atomic Shift podcast would be listened to on a laptop or through headphones, not necessarily in big expensive studios or in really hi-fi sort of sound systems. So the way that I've approached this from a sonic perspective is I wanted to keep everything in the mid to high range, so that these are the elements that come out when you're listening to it on these kind of mediums, laptop speakers, off your phone, etc., etc. And so these are some of the things to keep in mind. And this has been the production masterclass for the Atomic Shift podcast, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please follow me on Instagram at Springloaded. I do a lot more complex stuff on there, as well as share some of the work I do over here on records and in TV and film. Thank you. Thanks very much for joining me, and be in touch.